Next we come to the Secretary of the Deep State, Mike Pompeo, who recently published a sharp letter slamming the Vatican's plans to renew an agreement with the Chinese government on church operations in China. Really? And he promoted the article in a tweet concluding, "The Vatican endangers its moral authority." You're assuming they had any. They don't. Should it renew the deal? So now America's deep state dictates church policy as well now. Common sense question. Why and how is it their business? But an indignant Vatican took the article more as a calculated affront than a diplomatic gesture, and friction broke into the open on Wednesday as Mr. Pompeo arrived in Rome and met with prelates and others who are hostile to Pope Francis. So basically what they're telling you there then, he met with Langley CIA agents. Just saying. Now, the Vatican denied him a meeting with the pontiff and rebuffed his efforts to derail the deal with China. Pompeo asked to meet the Pope, who turned him down because Francis had clearly said that he does not receive political figures ahead of elections, according to Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who as Secretary of State is the Vatican's second-ranking official. But to some observers on both sides of the tensions between the Roman Catholic Church and the Trump administration, Mr. Pompeo's visit is as much about the coming presidential election as about Chinese policy. Now, Mr. Pompeo dismissed that suggestion as absurd, but intended or not, his trip signals that President Trump is on the side of those conservative American Catholics who worry about the Church's direction under Francis and think he is soft on China. Hello, McFly, Mr. Trump. If dealing with China is such an issue as stated, I'm going to ask another common sense question. What about Jared Kushner and his involvement with China for overpriced and microchipped masks? Yes, you heard that right. We'll have more on that later. And the article goes on. Francis and Mr. Trump, who have exchanged sharp words in the past, present starkly different visions on issues ranging from the environment to immigration to the threat of populism. Yes, that is called faction fighting, and it's got nothing to do with making America great again as promised. Now, in appealing to the Vatican's support for religious freedom as a reason to drop its China agreement, Mr. Pompeo seemed to seek common ground, but in a way that upset the Pope's chief allies and delighted his chief critics. Religious freedom. They said that about the pilgrims, and yet they only came here to rape the country and kill the natives. Religious freedom's my arse, Mr. Pompeo. Dear me. Really, are we still using that same script from 500 years ago? Religious freedoms. Anyway, Cardinal Parolin said Mr. Pompeo's article had caused surprise at the Vatican because this visit to Rome by the Secretary and the meetings with high officials at the Holy See has already been in the works and would have been a more opportune forum for airing grievances. And he also added that Mr. Pompeo's choice to publish in First Things, which is a conservative Christian magazine that has called Francis a failure as a pope, also mattered. But your failure to look after the American people's interests only and not factions is a spectacular failure, Mr. Secretary of the Deep State. Now, Pompeo declined to respond to the remarks of Cardinal Parolin, whom he will meet at the Vatican on Thursday. And the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Mr. Parolin, told reporters that Pope Francis had to turn down a meeting with Pompeo because he does not receive the political figures ahead of elections. And they know that. Now, for decades, China's communist, read Zionist, government operated a Catholic church that it controlled, insisting that Beijing, not the Vatican, had the power to appoint bishops whilst persecuting priests and parishioners who answer to the Holy See. And under the 2018 agreement, China recognised some papal authority, papal bull, and the Church accepted the legitimacy of bishops chosen by Beijing and a shameful retreat, according to France's critics. And it is a deal that the two sides are trying to renew, and Cardinal Parolin said delicate negotiations over the future appointment of bishops would go ahead. Now, Mr. Pompeo, who consistently promotes religious freedom and verbally thrashes China's leadership, talked to reporters on Wednesday afternoon about bringing the Vatican's moral authority to bear on China. And he said American policy was to bring, quote, every actor who can benefit the people of China to take away the horrors of the authoritarian regime. There's that word again we used a lot in the opening piece. Actor. Yes, Mr. Pompeo, there are lots of actors in the aptly named theatre of war. But Mr. Pompeo has not been bashful about using religious backdrops for political messages. He addressed listen closely, the Republican National Convention from Jerusalem. What a surprise that is. A Republican convention in Jerusalem. Oh my, Mr. Kushner and his string pullers will have approved of that, no doubt. Another common sense question. Why is a Republican convention for an American election being held in a foreign country? Could that not be perceived as foreign collusion of an election? Just saying. Now, earlier this month at a Baptist megachurch in Plano, Texas, he describes China's abuse of the Uyghur Muslims as a war on faith. So suddenly they're interested in Muslims when they've been bombing them to death for the past 30 years. And he then urged the congregation to vote on November the 3rd. And Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Vatican foreign minister, was asked whether Mr. Pompeo had sought to manipulate the Vatican for political purposes. And he said that is one of the reasons that the Holy Father, it's not holy, it's not anyone else's father either, is not receiving the Secretary of State, he said. Cardinal Parolin said he had no evidence that Mr. Pompeo's article and visit were meant to aid the president's re-election, but it is a thought that can be made. Desperate stuff and actions to play the faction games, Mr. Pompeo. And our group knows the Jesuits are your rival faction. You are paid to look after the interests of the American people, not fly around the world at our expense to far-flung countries dictating their policies. Next category, weather wars and fake climate change. We're going to Italy again. At least one person has died and at least 19 are missing after a powerful storm hit southern France and northwestern Italy this week. Named Alex, it brought fierce winds and torrential rains and causing severe floods. And a number of villages suffered serious damage around the southern city of Nice, and its mayor described it as the worst flooding in living memory. In northern Italy, several roads and bridges were swept away by floodwater, while several rivers burst their banks. And the man who died was an Italian firefighter in the Aosta Valley. Another 11 people are said to be missing in the country's northwest region after heavy rains then hit overnight. In the Piedmont region, several villages were cut off after the rains made roads impassable, and the situation there was described as extremely critical by officials. Hundreds of aid workers have been sent to help rescue efforts in the cut-off villages, and the storm also affected the northwestern regions of Lombardy and Liguria. The city of Venice, which had been braced for high waters after suffering violent storms in August, was successfully protected by the flood barrier system recently declared fully operational. Now, the reason I put this in is with the recent hurricane in Greece added into the mix, in regions traditionally not prone to these level of storms. Is this weather wars? Or is it an example the tilt of the world is moving quicker and more northern sections are moving southwest, as our show hypothecated? Or is it both? Here comes helicopter head, Prince Charles, who said climate change poses such a severe threat that the world's only option is to adopt a military-style response reminiscent of the US Marshall Plan, oh dear, to rebuild post-war Europe, according to Prince Charles on Monday. A long-time advocate for nature, really. The British Royal said climate change was rapidly becoming a comprehensive catastrophe that will dwarf the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So now we have a royalist acting as a climate change specialist. Are you seeing a pattern yet? He went on, at this late stage I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people and the planet. And this was what he said in a video recorded for the launch of a week of virtual climate change events in New York. No surprise there either. And he said we must now put ourselves on a warlike footing, approaching our action from the perspective of a military-style campaign, he said. This is a justification and also a heads up to us, you know how they have to tell us, that a military-led martial law plan will be rolled out globally. That's what they're going to try. Common sense question again. What is the trustee and the highest national security clearance doing to prevent this event? In the light of the sad death this week of Eddie Van Halen, and my message to Charlie is in the next song. Prince Charles, please go to the tallest cliff and